that you might be able to use to be able to accelerate your entrepreneurial journey. And this is part 2 of a multi-part series on how I'm preparing for a recession. If you go back to my previous Facebook Live, you'll see there are a few reasons why I am a little bit wary that Australia is heading at best for a lull and at worst for a recession. Now, Australia's been pretty lucky in the last 20 years, consistent growth, consistent progress, a lot of that fueled by some good policy, a lot of that fueled by pulling minerals out of the ground and selling them internationally. I think everyone's kind of aware that those days are over. And so what are we going to do about it when Australia hits a flat spot, and are you ready? Because here's one of the things that I know is I've been through 3 major economic cycles now. It's one of the benefits of having a global business that hasn't been insulated like Australia has been. And you've heard it all, right? When it all goes south, that's the time to buy, right? So there are a few things that I want to share with you that I'm doing that you might find useful as well to be able to prepare for a downturn in the market, right? Of course, preparing for a downturn and doing it well is one of the things you can do to be able to help really accelerate your entrepreneurial journey, right? So we use the CRASH acronym, sensationalism at its best, crash, blood on the streets. In the last Facebook Live, which you can just kind of scroll down and see it, I talk about the architecture behind how we build and protect a cash buffer, even if you think you don't have a profitable business. The stuff I talked about in the last live is about how we enforce having a profitable business, and there's a few important points in there. Today I'm going to focus on certainly part 1 of this bit here, which is about reducing costs and also complexity. I'm not sure I'll get to that today. It is a Saturday after all. We're going to talk about automation and building assets. We're talking about standing out as the go-to person, which creates a lot of efficiency. And we're talking about getting help, not just thinking about who can you help if the market goes a bit bland, but also who can help you. So I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to talk about reducing costs, right? So let's just get rid of this here. And I might just, for a moment, come back and eyeball you guys for a second, because reducing costs does not mean doing less, right? Spending less does not equal doing less. And that's really important to understand. I'm not talking about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so there's a couple of frameworks that I want to share with you that I think you might find useful. Essentially, there are 3 stages that we go through every quarter that really helps us optimize our business on a range of different levels, right? So let me go through them. The first is to recognize the hotspots. The second is to prioritize what you're going to look at cutting. And the third is incentivizing that outcome. So if you're just tuning in, this is a bit of a series I'm doing, not just about how to accelerate your journey, but how to get you thinking about preparing for a downturn in the economy. We use the CRASH architecture, which stands for cutting costs, reducing expenses, assets, and automation, standing out as the go-to person, and also help. Who can you help and who can help you? So in this conversation, I'm going through the cost reduction, right? So let's switch back here and let's get into some cost reduction stuff, right? So the first step that I mentioned, number 1, is to recognize the hotspots. And there are 3 ways that I encourage you to do this, right? The first is to be able to recognize any recent increases in costs. So what we do is every single quarter, we go through our entire P&L line by line by line, looking at every single expense on the last quarter. So the first thing we're looking for, it might be a bit small, right? We're looking for any recent increases. The next thing we're looking for is we're looking for the highest values, right? So if you've had something that's a couple of small expenses, but then there's like something that's really quite, above the Bollinger Band, so to speak. And you want to look out for those. The third that you want to look for is the one with the ones with the greatest variability. So if you've got anything that's kind of going like up, down, up, down, up, down, tends to imply that there's not enough control around that. So that's step one, right? And literally this isn't all that complicated. We just book in a time, we get the whole team involved, we print out all of the expenses line by line by line by line by line, and we go through it. Now, as your organization gets more complex, of course, you can break that down. You can break that apart for teams. You can have different teams go through different components. But step one is recognize the hotspots. Step two is to prioritize. And let me give you some ideas on how you can think about prioritizing. So the first thing that I recommend is using this little graph here, right? Where on the top here on the Y, we're going to put mission critical. And on the X, we're going to put highly valued. We're going to put a little box there. So this might sound pretty obvious, but you want to look at all of the different hotspots that you've recognized, recent increases, highest values, or the greatest variability, and you want to put them through the filter of, are they mission critical, yes or no, and are they highly valued, yes or no. So something that might be mission critical and highly valued, we run the Key Person of Influence Accelerator. It'd be very hard to do that without some of our key speakers. For example, we bring in high net worth entrepreneurs to work with our clients. So that would fit into this category here, in which case we're going to keep those. If we were to come down into something that's not necessarily mission critical, but it's highly valued, right? Let's think of an example. It might be something like, the fridge or the cooler in the team room, right? Now, what you're going to do here is because it's not mission critical, you're not just automatically going to keep it just because it's highly valued. You're going to look at different ways that you could reduce anything in that column. So if we're talking about, the fridge in the staff room or in the team room, instead of having that stocked with expensive bottles of water, you might find a cheaper option, or instead of bottles of water, you might have a cooler next to it. And instead of, the fanciest organic juices you can find, you might find something simpler in the short term. So you might, even though it's highly valued, you don't want to so much reduce the effectiveness, but you might just want to reduce how much you're spending on that. So see if you can reduce that there. Then we've got something that's mission critical, but isn't all that valued, right? So this might be something like printing or some kind of a commoditized thing. And so there's three things we're going to do here. We're going to negotiate. So that might mean you might go to your supplier and you might say, hey, either I can get a discount from you, or we're going to have to, go out and get some additional quotes on this. You can look at it and see if it's something you can automate. And I'm going to be talking about automation and developing assets in a further video, or you can look at ways to be able to delegate. So what we'll often find here is I will look at, and sometimes I'll look at the payroll when it comes on here, and I'll see that my team are doing mission critical work, but it's low value work. So we might delegate that to somebody else on the team that isn't having as high an impact on the P&L. So that if basically we want to delegate to juniors, to interns, or to people of that nature, where we can still hit the mission critical for the lower value tasks or activities. And of course, if something is low mission critical and low value, then what we're going to do, in fact, you know what, I'm going to change it. We're going to go and cut that. So that is the first kind of layer of taking those hotspots. So again, if you're just tuning in, we're talking about some ways to be able to reduce costs as coming up to a recession. What we want to look for is we want to look at every single line item on our P&L. We want to go any recent increases in costs, what are the highest values, and what are the costs that seem to have the greatest variability over time. We want to apply those through a layer of what's mission critical, highly valued, not mission critical, low valued, and you can see some instructions in the columns there that we've just gone through. Then we're going to transition to a second box test over here. Right, this is the second phase of prioritization. Nice and simple. Up the top left, we're going to have, in fact, I'm going to change the color here to greatest gains versus simplicity versus complexity. Right, so it's kind of simple. If something has really great gains, like, oh, we can make a lot of savings and it's pretty simple to implement, we're going to do that first, right? If we then go and look at, well, it's not going to get a huge gain, which would be down here, but it's relatively simple, we're actually going to do that second, because otherwise this is the realm of death with 1,000 cuts. Death by 1,000 cuts is number 2. So while the gains might not be as high, they're low gains, simple to implement, we're going to get rid of that next. Number 3 is what has the greatest gains but the most complexity to actually enforce and create those savings. We're going to do that third. And then finally, we're going to do number 4 is what has the lowest gains but is the most complex. Right, so that might take time. So that's how we recognize the hotspots, recent increases, highest values, greatest variability. We take that down to prioritize against mission critical versus highly valued, and then we put it into the greatest gain. So I'll give you an example from down over here. I remember when I first started my business, I'll just switch to camera, right? Super, super simple stuff, right? So we were running workshops. I was having a pitching mentor come in. His name was Ian Elliott. He used to be the CEO of George Patterson, closes over $1 billion worth of negotiations and sales, brought him in to work with our clients on improving their pitch. This is 8 years ago. And I'm like, you know how they have those little, you go to a conference and they've got those shitty little mints, yeah? Right? And I'm like, shitty little mints. No, we're going to get macadamia nuts. So I went down the organic store and I got like a couple of kilos of macadamia nuts, put them in little bowls on all the tables. I'm like, yeah, this is great. And then if some of you know my story, we went through like a couple of years of like rapid growth. We became the 9th fastest growing company in Australia. We just turned it up, right? Because that's what I'm good at. And by the way, if you want to learn some more strategies for how to be able to kind of really accelerate your growth, one of the things I encourage you to do, check out kpiwebinar.com. I go into like in that, if we go back to the, I can't do it, the 4th layer of crash, being able to stand out as the go-to person of your industry. That's what I focus on going into on kpiwebinar.com. I've got 9 years experience helping produce the go-to people of particular industries. So if you're interested in checking that out, if you're liking some of those ideas, but you want to reinforce that one in particular, check out kpiwebinar.com. So anyway, macadamia nuts. And we grew super fast. We expanded from Melbourne into Sydney, into Brisbane. We're running like about 150 workshops a year across all of those. And all of a sudden, we're not making any money, right? So I didn't just freaking come up with this stuff. I've accumulated these kind of principles over time to solve extreme pain of like, holy shit, if I don't sort this stuff out, I'm not going to have a freaking business, because my nature is sales and marketing, right? My nature isn't good governance and cost control, as you probably know. I'm not a freaking accountant. I like selling shit and talking to people. So finally, just before we kind of blow ourselves up and go out of business, I go, well, let's just look at line by line of our expenses. Yeah, because I also had the misunderstanding that my accountant was going to be super proactive and do all that kind of stuff for me. Right? I was really naive in the early days of business. Right, you've got to take personal responsibility for this stuff. So anyway, line by line by line by line by line, and then I'm like, literally, there was the word nuts and $35,000. $35,000. This is before I had managers and understood any of the stuff I understood then. $35,000, nuts. And I'm like, what is this? And they're like, oh, dig into it. Oh, it's the macadamia nuts we put on the thing. And I'm like, are we still doing that? Like, are you kidding me? $35,000 on nuts, and we're not making any money, right? And I'm like, freaking the hell out. So if we go back to my little matrix here, hey little guy, hey there little matrix, right? So of course, we've got here mission critical. So highest values would fall under that. That's a crazy high value. And also you could say a recent increase. Wasn't particularly hugely variable though. It was pretty consistent. So of course, is it mission critical? No. Was it highly valued? And I decided at that point when it was do or die, no, cut, easy, right? As opposed to a team retreat, might not be mission critical. You can get away without having a team retreat, but it's highly valued. So instead of cutting it, you might just reduce the fanciness of it and find the minimum viable product. Negotiate printing, or what's some other stuff that you could venue hire. Any of your suppliers, right? Essentially going to your suppliers, negotiating better terms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, greatest gains. Well, by cutting that, I'm going to instantly get 35 grand profit. And this is the thing: profit back to the bottom line, and it's super simple to do. So I'm going to do that first. So this is what I highly encourage everyone to kind of go and do straight away. First of all, there's a third thing which I'm going to get to quickly before we run out of time. But step one. No, actually, I'll just do it now. Step one, got to recognize the problem hotspots. Recent increases, highest values, greatest variability. We've got to put them through a prioritization matrix. Step one, mission critical versus highly valued. Step two, greatest gains versus complexity. So, for example, I'm not a huge fan of the CRM that we're using currently, but the complex, and I think we would get some benefits in moving away from it. However, the complexity of doing that to a global group is just so high, it's on a do later type thing. So number three, rounding this sucker out. I'll see if I can fit it on this bit of paper. Number three is to incentivize. Now, that does not mean that you need to give away all of the cash savings that you're going to make to your team for helping do that, right? So that's not what I'm saying, although you can, and it might be useful to put a bit of a bounty on it. The first thing I recommend around incentivizing is you make it a game. Make it part of your team culture, get your team bought into it. So this is something that we're doing as a team, because as we start moving into a tighter economic market, the incentivization for your team is that they keep their jobs, right? They keep their jobs. We don't have to cut wages. Like, those are the last things we can do. So the first layer of incentivization is you get to still work here, which is kind of cool too. Hey, Carl, thanks for tuning in, mate. And by the way, Carl is saying some cool stuff. Thank you, Carl. I appreciate you. I love the Matrix too. So step one, make a game out of it. The second step around incentivizing is build it into the culture through rhythm and pulse. What do I mean by that? Well, I highly recommend every business has, at the very least, a weekly all hands meeting, where part of the conversation on that weekly all hands meeting, so that's where the rhythm and pulse is coming in. It's every single week, we're talking about the game of saving some cash, right? And so that becomes a nice competitive culture in terms of how we can be more efficient, because one of the things that kind of culture will kill is this kind of dumb thinking of, oh, well, that's just the way we've always done it around here, right? So once we put it through the mission critical filter, that whole bullshit of, oh, that's just how we do it, goes out the window, because every process gets examined through the lens of, is it mission critical, not mission critical, as opposed to, this is just the way we've done it. So it's really important to have that lens of mission critical and greatest gains. The next key around incentivizing is through transparency. What I mean by that is my team have full access to our financials, right? That's a whole other conversation. However, what that does is it's like having a very transparent scorecard. Every game, every single game that is a competitive game in the world has a scorecard that is visible to the people on the team, right? So everyone can look up as they're playing the game and see what the score is. There's the transparency of results and outcome. It's very hard to be able to get your team to be able to buy into reducing costs overall if no one can actually see what the numbers are they making progress, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one of the huge benefits, in my opinion, to be able to give your team full access. And there are some ways in which you need to potentially frame that. And if that's something of interest, hit me up in the comments below. And based on the demand, I can do another video in terms of how we think about doing that. The next thing that is super important, and I'll just go back here, is ownership. Someone needs an accountability. Someone needs to own and be accountable for the particular line item. So if it's nuts, someone's in charge of solving the nuts problem. And then finally, we've got rewards. And that's where you might be able to say that as a team, if we're able to reduce costs by X, 5%, 10%, 20% before Y, first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, then that equals some kind of a reward. It doesn't have to be a cash reward. It could be something as simple as, we all go out to dinner and have a good time, have a laugh, go bowling, whatever the case may be. So let me just bring us back for a rapid fire summary. I'm talking about ways in which we are preparing, and the way we prepare may help you prepare for a recession. So the first is to build a cash buffer. If you go back to my previous live, you will see me going into some detail around the architecture on how we force profit and cash into our business model. The second is reducing costs and complexity. I focused on that in this one. In future lives, I'm going to get into reducing complexity in your business model, creating automation and assets, standing out as the go-to person, which creates efficiencies all the way down the line through attracting customers and retaining team. And again, I'm just going to remind everyone on that one, if you guys are interested, check out kpiwebinar.com, where I deep dive into the standing out element, how to stand out as that go-to person, what we would call that key person of influence in your industry. By far and away, that is one of the most powerful things you can do to protect yourself in any kind of downturn, because the key people of influence, the go-to people, attract clients, partners, media, investors all the things required to weather the storm cheaper than anyone else. So if you haven't checked out my webinar or heard me talk about those 5 principles before, get onto that webinar as well. And then finally in this series, I'm going to be talking about help, not just who can help you, but also who can you help as we go through a bit of an economic downturn. If you're very clear on who you can help and who you can serve, but also who can help you, and I'm going to be talking about partnerships and alliances, things of that nature, these 5 things combined create a very, very powerful tool for weathering any kind of storm. If we go into the reduced costs, just as a summary, every single quarter we pull up our P&L and we go through, have there been any significant recent increases on last quarter? What are the costs that have the highest values for examination? And what are the costs that have the greatest variability? Because that tends to imply there's not a lot of control or process in place. Step 2, we need to, once we've recognized the areas for potential improvement, we need to prioritize those areas. We look at it through the lens of mission critical versus highly valued. So if it's mission critical and highly valued, you keep it. If it's mission critical, not so highly valued, you cut it. If it's mission critical and low value, you want to create negotiation, so find better suppliers. You want to create automation, or you want to delegate it to people in your team that can get the same stuff done without costing you as much money. But if it's mission critical, if it's not mission critical and highly valued, you want to reduce it. And I use the team fridge as the example. Instead of it being full of, Fuji water at $10 a bottle, maybe you put some thank you water in there instead. You get the idea. Or ideally, put a bubbler and a filter and get rid of plastic entirely. Then, once you've kind of prioritized what are you going to keep, what's in this category, what's in this category, what's in this category, then you put it through the next layer of prioritization, going, all right, what has the greatest gains and is the simplest to apply? So for me, that was getting rid of freaking macadamia nuts, nice and easy. We want to do number 2 might be low gains, but simple to do. That allows you to protect yourself from death from 1,000 cuts. Number 3, greatest gains, but more complex. And number 4, for obvious reasons, low gains, complex to implement, do that last. Finally, you want to incentivize it by creating a game and a culture which has regular focus on reducing costs and explaining why that is important for the team. Part of the incentivization could simply mean you get to keep your job, as opposed to having to shower them with rewards and gifts. Even rewards and gifts don't need to be fancy cash bonuses. It could be let's all go bowling, or let's have a Friday off, or whatever it is. Transparency is super important. They need to be able to see the score. When I say they, I mean your team. And for every line item, one person needs to have ownership and accountability to be able to move the needle. So that has been a mini masterclass in how to think about reducing your costs to prepare for a crash. My name is Glenn Carlson. I hope you find that useful. If you have, I'm going to ask you a favor. I'm going to ask you, hang on a second. I've got some questions that have come through, right? So where is part 1? If you're watching this on the Facebook, Scott, just scroll back down. It's probably the last post before this one, right? I'm pretty sure the title is How I'm Preparing for a Recession. This one will be part 2, and then you can look for part 3, 4, and however many parts it is, right? But I'm going to kind of deconstruct this because I'm a little bit nervous. We have a potential challenger government that is potentially going to do some things to the economy that I think is going to be less than fiscally sound. And I want you guys to prepare for it. I want you guys to be prepared. Worst case freaking scenario, the needle doesn't move, but you guys are cashed up and ready to go. And that's awesome, Neil. Yep, check out the replay. Absolutely. Hey, what's cool about these lives, by the way? And this is the thing. You might be, why is Glenn doing a Facebook Live to 5 freaking people? Well, I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you scroll back through some of my lives over the last 2 weeks, we're getting 10 to 15 times the engagement of that over the sort of the following 5 days. So the thing to get about lives, I don't have any ego attached. If there's one person watching this, and for those of you like Carl and Scott and Neil, awesome, appreciate you tuning in. But I'm going to have 5 times that check into this over the next week, right? So that's kind of interesting, right? So all of a sudden, 5 people, that turns into 25 people. People work really hard to put a room of 25 people together. I'm also doing this at freaking random times all over the place. I'm not in any way trying to coordinate this as an experiment just to kind of see what happens. It's also a really great tool for me just getting shit out of my head super efficiently for my team to be able to repurpose that. I'm going to be showing you more ways in which we're doing that kind of as we go through. So I want to say thanks for tuning in. Thanks for your comments. Check out the replays. Check out the future plays if you've come across this. Today is the 6th of April. It is a Saturday. It is 11:38 as I'm tuning out. So depending on when you're watching this, see the whole lot. Let me know what you think. My name's Glenn Carlson. Be brave. Have fun. Let's go make a dent in the universe, shall we?